Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Beis, and Yes Hashem, today we will be learning Daf Ayin Gimel Amud Beis as well as a piece of Ayin Dalet Amud Aleph. We are beginning a new Siman today, Siman Kuf Ayin Aleph, Shaloi Linhoig Bizayin Ba'achlin, that you should not act with food in a way that degrades the food. You should not be mevaza, you should not degrade food. The Rebbeinu Shalom gave you a gift. The Rebbeinu Shalom gave us the food that we need for our nutrition to give us kayach, and we should not degrade food. Before we begin our learning tonight, our learning should be a schus for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, Hanesunim Atzara B'Shivya, Ha'imdim Bein Bayam Bein Bayabasha, Hamakan Yirakem Aleihem, V'Yitzim Mitzal L'Rvacha Me'afelu La'Oro Mishibud L'Geula, Hashta Bagalo V'Zman Kariv and Emaramein. And our learning should be a schus refuah shalema for our real Yosef ben Miriam Rezel and Meir ben Chayet Sarah. Says the Mechaber Sif Aleph, Oisa Adam Tzrachav Papas. A person could use bread for his own purposes. In other words, you could use bread to accomplish other tasks other than eating. But, says the Mechaber, V'hani mili deloi mimispe. But that's only true if you are not going to make the bread disgusting by doing that. If you're going to ruin the bread and you're going to make the bread mos, then you're not allowed to use it for other purposes. Avo midi de mimispe, but to do something with the bread that's going to render the bread mos, loy, that you're not allowed to do. So, very simply put, the very first halachah that the Mechaber tells me over here is, you are allowed to use bread for other purposes other than eating. But the Mechaber gives us a very important caveat. That's only true if you're not going to ruin the bread by doing that. But if you're going to ruin the bread, if you're going to make it mos, then you're not allowed to use the bread for other purposes. And the Mechaber is going to give us examples. Like, for instance, the Mechaber is going to tell you, you cannot take raw meat and put raw meat down on top of bread. Because by placing raw meat on top of the bread, you're going to ruin the meat. Now you're going to ruin the bread. Now you can't eat the bread. You made the bread mos. So therefore, you're not allowed to do it. So you're allowed to use bread for tasks other than eating, but not if you're going to ruin and make the bread mius. Now, in the Mishnah Berurah, we're going to see some great exceptions to this rule. Says the Mishnah Berurah's Katan Aleph, Tzrachav, you're allowed to use bread for your needs. Tzrachav means for your needs. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Ritzon Loimar, what the Mechaber wants to say is, Tzarech Tashmishav, you could use it for the purpose of fulfilling your needs. Ukamaisha Yispar Lekamei, like the Mechaber is going to discuss as we move forward. Ois Cotton Bays, Bapas, the Mechaber specifically mentions one food item. He mentions bread. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'cholshkein b'sha'ar ochlin. Bread is the most chashuv of all foods. Therefore, if the Mechaber tells me that I'm allowed to make use of bread for other purposes other than eating, kolshkein is a kavachimer, I'm allowed to use other foods for purposes other than eating. Then the Mechaber told me, this is only true if you're not going to make the bread mius, if you're not going to ruin the bread. Avo midi de mimis, but if you're going to use the bread for a purpose that's going to render it mos, that the Mechaber said you're not allowed to do. Says the Mishnah Berurah's Katan Gimel, avo midi de mimis, something that's going to cause the bread to be disgusting. Va'afilu b'sha'ar achlin gam kein aser. If it is the same way in Ois Cotton Bays, the Mechaber told me, if you're allowed to use bread for tasks other than eating, then certainly kavachimer, you're allowed to use other foods for such purposes. Now the Mechaber tells me, if you're not allowed to use bread for something that's going to render the bread mos, then you're also not allowed to use other foods in a way that's going to render them mius. Va'afilu b'sha'ar achlin gam kein aser, ois cotton dalet loy. The Mechaber said you're not allowed to use bread or other foods in a way that's going to make them mius. Now the Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us an exception to this rule. Says the Mishnah Berurah, V'em oisa l'refuah, Let's say you're using food for medicinal purposes. Shari, that's mutter, afilu mimispe, that's mutter, even if by doing so, you're going to ruin the food and render the food disgusting. Like we're going to see later on in Hilchos Shabbos in Siman Shin Chav Ches Siv Chav. Okay, so the first exception that the Mishnah Berurah tells me here is, it's true, you're not allowed to use food for something that's going to render it disgusting and ruined. However, if you need to use food for medicinal purposes, then you're allowed to ruin the food. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah, another exception. Even if you want to make use of food for something other than refuah. If you want to use food for something that is recognized as a tzarech, you want to use food for something that is recognized as a need, and it is the derech ha'olam. It's the way of the world. People use food for that usage. That would also be mutter. And the Mishnah Berurah gives us an example here. He says, for this reason, you're allowed to sprinkle the floor with wine. This is referring to back in the day when they had dirt floors. Now, by dirt floors, very often you would sprinkle the floor with a liquid to hold down the dust, right? Like this, the dust could get kicked up and it comes up into the air. But if you take water or you take another liquid and you sprinkle it, the moisture holds the dust down. Now, they used to use wine for that purpose because by using wine, you accomplished a dual purpose. First of all, you held down the dust, but second of all, the wine had a pleasant fragrance. So you also deodorized the room. Now, certainly by doing this, you're ruining the wine. You're rendering the wine mius. You're taking the wine and you sprinkle it on the floor. So this would seem to be using a meichel, using a food item for a purpose other than eating that renders it mius. Yet we see that it's mutter. Says the Mishnah Berurah, why is it mutter? Because there's a category of usages of food items where you're using it for something which is a recognized tzarech ha'adam, and it's the minhag ha'olam, it's the way of the world to use the food for that item. And that, the Mishnah Berurah says, is mutter. And he gives us another example. V'sachin haguf, you're allowed to anoint the body, b'yayin, using wine, v'shemen, or using oil, kamavor b'gamar b'kamaduchti, like is very clear in different places in Shas, in the Gemara. So I know people who use olive oil all the time. You have chapped hands during the winter. They swear by it. Instead of using Vaseline or hand creams or hand moisturizers, they use olive oil. And they say that olive oil works better than anything else. And if you use it all the time, it mamish moisturizes the skin. And sooner or later, you have no problem with chapped hands anymore. Now, certainly by taking the olive oil and smearing it on your hands, you're taking a meichel, you're taking olive oil, and you're rendering it useless. You're not able to use it anymore as a food item. Yet you see that it's mutter. Why? Because the dry skin, a moisturizer, is a recognized tzarech ha'adam, and it's the minhag ha'olam to use oil to smear on the body. My father, Olav Shalom, used to tell me about his father in Europe, in Salish, in the pre-war years, who had a grocery store. And they had dried egg powder, and they had it in two qualities. They had one quality which was used as a food additive, and then they had an inferior quality that was used to mix with water and shine the floor. We know that when people make challah, they put an egg wash on the challah to make the challah shiny. Apparently, they used to use an egg wash to shine the floor. So over there, too, you're using something which is ultimately a food item, and you're rendering it mius and you're rendering it useless by using it to shine the floor. But that's mutter because it's a tzarech ha'adam, and it's the derech ha'olam to do that. So again, the Mishnah Berurah said over here, he said 2 points. One, even though the Mechaber said you're not allowed to use food for things other than eating if it's going to render the food mos, said the Mishnah Berurah there are exceptions. One exception is refuah. If you're using the food for medicinal purposes, you can use the food even though you're going to ruin it. Second, if you have something which is a recognized tzarech ha'adam, and you want to use it for the tzarech ha'adam, and it's the minig ha'olam, it's the derech ha'olam, to use that food in that way, that's also mutter. And he gave us over here the examples: sprinkling wine on the floor, or using wine and oil to smear on the body. Now the Mishnah Berurah gives us something that you're not allowed to do. And what's interesting is that at first glance the Mishnah Berurah is like Iker Chasar Men HaSefer. The Mishnah Berurah doesn't tell me why what he's about to say is not true. But if we look to the Bir Halacha, we'll see the reason. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Aser liftsaya zeisim, you're not allowed to break open olives. So, when we think of olives, we think of those jarred, pickled olives with the pimento peppers, stuffed with pimento peppers. Those are processed olives. Over here, I'm talking about olives that you pick off the tree. Also, liftsaya zeisim, you're not allowed to break open olives, lital yadav b'mayim hayotzim mehem, to then wash your hands with the mayim. Notice he doesn't say shemen, with the liquid that comes out of the olives. Now, why would you want to do this? Says the Mishnah Berurah in the brackets, shechazokim heim, because the liquid that comes out of the olives, that liquid is very powerful. There's a better English word, but it's not coming to my head right away. There's a better English word over here, shechazokim heim. They're very strong. It's a very strong liquid. Uma'avirim es hazuama. And it could really cleanse the hands. It could remove grease and dirt from the hands. So you have this liquid in the olives. You want to break open the olives and use the liquid that comes out of the olives to wash your hands. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you're not allowed to do that. And the Mishnah Berurah says, why are you not allowed to do that? Because by doing this, you're ruining the olives. The olives become mias. You break them open to extract the liquid. Now the olives are ruined. And therefore, the Gemara in Shabbos says you're not allowed to do this because of hefsid oichlin. Now the question right away becomes, the Mishnah Berurah tells me you're not allowed to do this. Well, why not? We just saw that the Mishnah Berurah said you're allowed to cause hefsid oichlin. You're allowed to ruin food if you're using it for something which is a recognized tzarech adam, and it's the derech ha'olam. What is this person doing? He's ruining olives to wash his hands. Now, washing the hands is a recognized tzarech ha'adam. People have to wash their hands all the time. So that's a recognized tzarech ha'adam. So why can't you break open the olives and use the liquid to wash your hands? The Bir Halacha says the reason is because it's not the derech ha'olam. That's why you're not allowed to do it. You're not allowed to do it because, yes, it's a recognized tzarech ha'adam, but that's not the derech ha'olam. To sprinkle the floor with yayin, to put olive oil on your hands, that's a tzarech ha'adam, and it's the derech ha'olam. But to break open olives to wash your hands with the liquid that comes out of them, yes, it's a tzarech ha'adam, but it's not the derech ha'olam, and therefore it's aser. Now, as to why the Mishnah Berurah didn't mention that in the Mishnah Berurah, the only thing I can think is that if you look in the Bir Halacha Dibra Maschelai, I'm not going to go through it, it's a lengthy Bir Halacha, but this gets tied up in a machlokes, the Magen Avram and others. The Magen Avram did not learn this way. The Magen Avram learns that the reason the Gemara in Shabbos says that you're not allowed to break the olives open and wash with the liquid that comes out is because there's no purpose in it. Whatever you're trying to accomplish by washing your hands with that liquid, you can accomplish using buris. You could use soap. So don't use the liquid for the olives, use the soap. But many others take strong issue with this Magen Avram for reasons that are brought down in the Bir Halacha, and therefore the Chavetz Chaim didn't want to go with the Bir Halacha. Instead, the Chavetz Chaim is going with the Pshat and the Gemara in Shabbos. The reason you can't use the olives is because it's not the derech ha'olam la'asois kain. Okay, now let's go back into the Mechaber. Let's go to the second line here in Siman Kuf Ayin Aleph. So the Mechaber told me the halacha that yes, you are allowed to use bread and you are allowed to use other foods for purposes other than eating, but that's only if you're not going to ruin the food. Yes, we saw exceptions in the Mishnah Berurah, But now, says the Mechaber based on this, Hilkach, therefore, Ein manichin alav basar chai. You can't put raw meat down on top of a slice of bread, because by doing so, you're ruining the bread, and there's no reason to do this, so don't do it. You're not allowed to do it. Continues the Mechaber, Ve'ein ma'avirin alav kais mole. This is an interesting halacha. Let's say you're sitting by the Shabbos table, and you have a challah plate. So you have a plate full of beautiful slices of challah. Now, somebody, you pass your cup to somebody, and you ask him to fill it up with wine. And he does a kiddush job on your cup. He fills up your cup with wine all the way to the top, and now he's passing the full cup back to you. Says the Mechaber, do not pass that cup over the challah plate. Because since the kais is filled to the top, it's very, very possible that you're going to spill it. And if you spill it over the challah, you're going to ruin the challah. Now, I'm not picking on wine. It could be Pepsi. It could be orange juice. It could be iced tea. It doesn't matter what it is. Don't pass a full cup over the challah plate, because it's very possible that you'll spill on the challah and you'll ruin the challah. And since we're saying that you're not allowed to do things that are going to cause bizayin or cause hefsid to the oichlin, don't pass a full cup over the challah. Ve'ein mavirin alav kais mole. Continues the Mechaber, Ve'ein samchin by HaTorah. Do not use bread to support a plate, to support a serving plate. Imhi malaya, if the serving plate is full with davar, with stuff, she'im yipal ala pas, that if it spills on the bread, yima'es, the bread will become mos. So he's giving me here a few examples. He says, you're not allowed to cause bizayin, you're not allowed to cause ruination to the bread. So, number one, don't put raw meat on bread. Number two, which is a bigger chiddush, don't pass a full cup over the bread, because there's a risk that you might ruin the bread. Number three, you have a serving platter that has gravy in it. Don't put it down. Sometimes, go think back in the day. It could be that their plates were not so well made. Their serving platters weren't so well made. Their tables also weren't so well made. Maybe there was a need to balance the plate, so you needed to support the plate with something. Don't support the plate with a piece of bread. Why? Only because if the plate is full and it has stuff in it that if it spills out, it will ruin the bread, then you can't do it. How about if the plate's not full? How about if whatever it's full of is not going to ruin the bread? Then it would be mutter. Why? Because you're allowed to use bread for other tasks as long as you're not going to ruin the bread. The problem over here is that you're risking ruining the bread. That's why you're not allowed to do it. Now let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois katnehei, kais mole. Don't pass a full cup over the challah plate. Why? Shekarei vadavar, because it's very likely sheyishafri chalav, that you'll end up spilling on the challah. V'yamois, the challah will become mos, and you'll ruin the challah. Ois katnevav, this is only true. The Mechaber said you can't use the bread to support the ka'ara, to support the serving platter, if it's full of something that if it spills, it will ruin the challah. Ois katnevav imhi, v'gam kei mitam hanal. This is for the same reason. You're risking ruining the bread. Certainly, if the bottom of the serving plate is not clean, and just by virtue of putting the serving plate on top of the challah, you'll ruin the challah, then certainly you're not allowed to do it. Certainly if the underside of the ka'ara is not clean, so that the bread will become mos by virtue of putting the serving plate on top of it, then certainly you're not allowed to do it. The only time you're not allowed to do this is if the ka'ara is full of stuff that could possibly ruin the bread. But if the ka'ara is not full of something that if it spills will ruin the bread, shari l'smach, then it's mutter to put the serving plate down on top of the bread. After mishtamish papas, even though you're making use of the bread, the oisa adam kol tzracha papas v'chanal, because you're allowed to use bread for other tasks as long as you're not going to ruin the bread. V'hu adin the mutter l'chases bei kli. You could also use a piece of bread to cover up a keli. They didn't have everything that we have, covers for containers and this and that. If you want to cover something with a piece of bread, you're allowed to do that if you're not going to ruin it. Okay, now let's go further in the Mechaber. Says the Mechaber 3 lines down into Siman Kuf Ayin Aleph in the middle of the line. Ve'ein noitlin hayadayim b'yayin. You're not allowed to wash your hands with wine. Bein chai, bein mozog, whether the wine is a raw wine that has yet to be diluted with water, or bein mozog, or if it's already diluted. You see, if the yayin is chai, you might think there's no problem of biza oichlin. Maybe it's not considered an oichel yet. It's not ready to drink yet because it wasn't diluted yet. Says the Mechaber, it doesn't matter. Ein noitlin yadayim, you cannot wash your hands b'yayin using wine. Ben chai, whether it's raw and undiluted. Ben mozog, whether or not it's already diluted. Afilu netila she'ein tzarech achila. And this means you're not allowed to wash your hands. Forget netilas yadayim. We're not talking about netilas yadayim lapas. The netilas yadayim that you wash before the Suda, you're not allowed to do with wine anyway. Because we learned earlier in Hilchas netilas yadayim, we paskin, you're not allowed to do netilas yadayim with yayin. So says the Mechaber over here, ve'ein noitlan yadayim b'yayin ben chai ben mozog afilu netilas she'ein tzarech achila. Forget about netilas yadayim lapas. I'm talking about you just want to wash your hands. You're not allowed to wash your hands with wine. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katmeches, She'ein tzarech achila, de'ilu b'netila la'achila, if we would be talking about netilas yadayim lapas, netilas yadayim to get ready for the Suda, balav hachi aser l'kama poskim. According to many poskim, that's aser anyway. We saw a machlokes on this. Ayin b'simin kuf samach sif yod beis. But we paskin over there that you're not allowed to use yayin. Yayin you're not allowed to use even in a shasat chak. We paskin you're not allowed to use yayin because we don't consider yayin to be mayim. Other fruit juices might be mayim, but yayin doesn't have a din of mayim. De'ein netila ela b'mayim, and if it tells yadayim, you need mayim. Ela af pozeh she'ein tzarech achila. The Mechaber is telling me, even washing your hands, that's not netilas yadayim. You just want to wash your hands. You want to clean your hands. Aser, it's aser to do this with wine, mishum bezayin ayayin, because of bezayin oichlin. V'hu adin b'shar mashkin aser, and it's aser with orange juice too. It's aser with any potable beverage. You're not allowed to wash your hand with wine. You're not allowed to wash your hands with Pepsi. You're not allowed to wash your hands with orange juice. If it's a potable liquid, you're not allowed to use it to wash your hands, with the exception of mayim. Mayim you could use. Ubishasat chak. And as to the question of whether or not you could wash the netilas yadayim l'suda in a shasat chak using yayin or other beverages, ayin le'el b'sim kuf samach soif sif yud beis u'bebir halachah sham. And over there we paskin that b'shasat chak you could use other beverages other than wine for netilas yadayim in a shasat chak. In a shasat chak, you could use orange juice for netilas yadayim because orange juice has a din mayim. But yayin you can't use even for netilas yadayim, even b'shasat chak, because yayin does not have a din mayim. Now we go further, 2 lines off the bottom, near the middle of the line, right by the ois cotton test for the Mishnah Berurah, says the Mechaber, ve'ein zorkin hapas, you're not allowed to throw bread. Mishum bezayin oichlim, because of bezayin oichlim. Now, says the Mishnah Berurah here in Ois Cotton Tess, and this is a very important halacha. Ve'ein zarkin apas. You're not allowed to throw bread. Umevur bebeis Yosef. It is explained, and it's clear in the Beis Yosef, usha'ar paiskim and other paiskim as well. The pas chashiv tvei misha'ar oichlin. That bread is considered more chashiv than other food items, and therefore ubedidei. When it comes to pas, when it comes to bread, asur, you're not allowed to throw bread. Afilu loy nimas al yidei zrika. Even if the bread is not going to become ruined and moas by virtue of the fact that you threw it. Kigoin, for example, shezarka al gabi makom naki. You threw it into a nice clean place. You're still not allowed to throw bread. Dezilzul hulapas, because that is degrading to the bread. Now, I'll tell you a place where this is very negeya. Where this is very negeya is Shabbos by the Suda. You go ahead, the balabayas, the father, let's say, goes ahead and makes hamoitzi on the lechem mishnah, and then he cuts the lechem mishnah, and he's passing out the lechem mishnah, and it's kind of like dealing cards. Play kvitlach on Hanukkah. One of your young children is sitting down the table, and you get very good at it already. With a flick of the wrist, you throw the slice of challah, and it lands right in front of him on the table, and the table is nice and clean because you didn't start the Suda yet. So you're not risking making the challah mos. You're still not allowed to do it because you're not allowed to throw bread. Bread you're not allowed to throw even if it's not going to become mos. So what do? You pass it down. That's what you have to do. Or put the sliced up challah on a plate and pass around the plate. But you can't throw the challah. Says the Mechaber Weiter, second line from the bottom near the end of the line, the same way you're not allowed to throw bread, you're also not allowed to throw any other foods that might become mius by virtue of the fact that you threw them. Again, like the Mishnah Berurah just said, bread you're not allowed to throw even if it's not going to become mius. Other foods you're not allowed to throw if they're going to become mius. But foods that won't become mius by virtue of the fact that you threw them, like nuts that are hard, or rimonim, whole pomegranates. The Mechaber is assuming that a whole pomegranate is a tough fruit, is not going to become ruined if you throw it. An apple, if you throw it, you get a little bruise on an apple, the apple gets messed up. A pomegranate's not so easy to ruin. So, vachavushim, what are chavushim? I think chavushim are pickled foods. Shari, it's mutter to throw them if they're not going to become mius by virtue of the fact that you threw them. Says the Mishnah Berurah near the bottom of Ayin Gimel Amud Beis, foods hanimasim al yudei zrika, foods that could become mius by virtue of the fact that you threw them, kigoyin, for example, te'enim, figs, v'chadoima, and similar fruits, shenisbashlu kol tzarkon, that have ripened fully, shehem rakim, so that they're soft, umismachim al yudei zrika, they will become mushy, they'll become crushed and mushy if you throw them, v'namasim, and then they become mius. Take a nice ripe pear and throw it. One dent, and that's it. The pear is ruined. It's messed up. So you can't throw them. But things like nuts, shein koshim, that are hard, ve'ena mismachim, and they don't get crushed and bruised, those you could throw. However, says the Mishnah Berurah, umayri, and when the Mechaber says that you're allowed to throw these, he's talking about shezarku b'makom naki, where you're going to throw them so that they land in a clean place. The ilavachi, because if they're not going to land in a clean place, asar afilu be'egoizim, then it would be asar to throw them even if you're dealing with nuts, because by virtue of the fact that they land in a dirty place, they're going to become mius. Now the Mishnah Berurah tells us an important halachah. Kisheroyin oichlin munachim al haaretz. If you chance upon food laying on the ground, also leilechu lahanicham, you're not allowed to walk away and just leave it there. Elatzarch lahagbiam, you have to pick them up. Unless you're dealing with an instance where there might be some kind of issue of kishuf, kikar shalem, like the Gemara in Eruvin says, about a whole loaf of bread, there could be a possible issue that somebody put kishuf on it, and by picking it up, you might get yourself in trouble. Isa b'Gemara, the Gemara in Titus tells us, the Rav Huna Sover, Rav Huna held, Michael Adam ein machilin oisoi lebehema. You don't feed food that is edible for people to animals. Don't take perfectly good food and serve it to the dogs. You're degrading the food. V'uadin loifos, or the birds. Amnam, however, Bel Yerabba mistapik b'alachik Rav Huna bazeh. Bel Yerabba has a suffix if we paskel like Rav Huna. V'ayim b'machzah shekel, take a look at the machzah shekel, shemitzadid, who takes the position. Dim ein loy davar achel lahachil, ki machel adam. If you have nothing else to feed the animal other than a food that's fit for humans, l'kuli alma mutter, it's definitely mutter. The efshir, and it's possible to be shumazeh that for this reason, naihagina olam heter lahachil la'oifais pas, people are knowing that it's mutter to feed bread to the birds. Me personally, I always fed bread to the birds when it was going to go to waste. When the bread was already at the point where people aren't going to eat it anymore, yes, technically it was royal achila still, but nobody was going to eat it because there's fresh bread, because they're spoiled. So then, instead of taking the bread and wrapping it up and throwing it out, feed it to the birds. We used to take it to the park and feed it to the ducks and the geese, or put it outside in the backyard for the other birdies. But like this, or when I had chickens, we used to have chickens in the backyard, so the chickens were great for eating up your food waste. Like, your potato peels and your cucumber peels and the ends of the vegetables, even eggshells, believe it or not. Eggshells are a good source of calcium, and chickens need a lot of calcium. But regular, perfectly good food that's perfectly fit for human consumption, don't feed it to the animals. That would be degrading the food. Okay, we can stop over here. We'll continue next time with Sif Beis. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The source of limud HaTorah should be begging against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe should send Yeshua's refuahs panas and shidduchim to all those in need, and we should be zocheh to see the geula shleima with the bias gal tzedek b'meher v'yameinu. Amen. Be well.